enhance your brain. And in fact, one of them you may be familiar with, it's the Himalayan singing bowls. Many researchers have actually been researching these bowls over the last couple of years. And what they're finding is that just ringing the bowls at different frequencies can actually change brain activity. It can reduce blood pressure and heart rate, which overall has the effect of creating relaxation and helping people reach certain meditation states. And so these are two different tools or instruments that you can use to change your brain and enhance your well-being. So today I'm going to talk about using neurotechnologies to the same effect. And now what is a neurotechnology? Well, that's an instrument that you can use as a direct connection of hardware with the nervous system. So that allows you to directly interface with your brain and your nervous system. So there's actually two different types of neurotechnologies. One type is imaging. So this is any type of device that you can wear on your head or on your body that gives you a direct reading of your nervous system activity. So what you see on the screen here is an fMRI, so an MRI activity of the brain. Now the other type of neurotechnology, the kind that I've been mostly interested in over the past couple of years, is actually used to manipulate the brain directly. So what that means, like you can see in the picture here, this is a very strong magnet that you can put over the head, and it actually can cause the brain to fire, or you can change the brain to make it less likely to fire. This is called neuromodulation, and this is a very new form of neurotechnology. It's developed over the past 10 to 15 years. So let's talk a little bit about neurotechnologies for brain imaging. So as you know, as you're sitting there listening to my talk, your brain is firing electrical activity every moment that you're awake and you're listening. It creates this beautiful tapestry of electrical activity all across your brain, as you can see here. Now, it turns out that we can actually record that brain activity from electrodes that you put on your head. So this is called an electroencephalogram or an EEG. And it's pretty simple. It's what you saw earlier on the stage, but it's just different electrodes all across the top of your head. And the effect of that is in a readout of brain activity called brain oscillations or brain waveforms. And essentially, the different waveforms that you see here are corresponding to different types of brain activity. So for example, if you're really concentrating on what I'm talking about and you're really focusing hard and processing it, you'll see very fast brain activity called gamma waves. If you're getting sort of relaxed and maybe falling a little sleepy, what you would see is a slow oscillation in the brain known as an alpha wave. And actually, if you fall asleep, your brain waves will go very slow into the delta frequency. So this has been a very popular form of neurotechnology that's helped us to read brain activity and then relate it to different types of mental activities in the brain. Very recently, researchers have been interested in reading the brain activity of monks when they're meditating. So these are typically Buddhist monks doing various forms of attention meditation practices. And what happens is they bring these monks into the laboratory. So here's a monk in Richie Davison's lab at Wisconsin-Madison. And he's got about 200 electrodes on his head that are reading his brain activity. Now this is what his brain activity looks like from different electrodes. And right here is the moment when they told him to meditate. They actually rang a little bell and he started meditating. And what you can see is that the moment he starts meditating, his brain activity changes dramatically. So it goes from a relatively slow little oscillation to very quick, fast activity almost at every electrode across his brain. And so what that tells us is that whatever state he's putting his brain in when he's meditating, it's doing a lot of brain activity to get into that state. And that helps us understand exactly how he's focusing his brain. This is called gamma EEG. So based on that study, a company called Muse, a study like that and other studies, a company called Muse created a wearable EEG headband. So that's what you just saw earlier on the stage. And essentially, it has little electrodes that go across your forehead. And what those electrodes do is they read out 4 channels of EEG. Now, this is a consumer product, so you can buy this off of the internet. And the point of this product is to wear it when you're learning how to meditate. So this person may have never meditated before in his life, and he wears this EEG device on his head, and what it's going to do is it's feeding information into his electrodes to try to put his brain into a meditative state. And as soon as the EEG reads out the meditative state, he gets positive feedback. And as soon as his mind starts wandering, or he starts thinking about dinner, or whatever else he's thinking about, then it gives him a different tone. And then he gets some idea about what a meditative state should be like. So this is one example of how neuroscience has gone from the lab and into a consumer product directly to help people with their well-being and meditation states. Now, there's been all kinds of different EEG systems that have come out in the past couple of years. Each of these systems can be purchased off the internet from a couple $1,000s to tens of thousands of dollars. And they're all designed for different applications. For example, this is another meditation device here. This one's actually used to help treat certain psychological symptoms like depression or anxiety. And the other two can be used for various applications. But this is an exciting sort of explosion in neurotechnology because as these devices become cheaper, they become available for consumers to use them for various applications. And what's been interesting over the past couple of years is these devices have then been applied in the educational setting. So this was a study that was done in the United States, and they were curious about what happens in a group of students when they're all studying together. The question was, do their brain waves and their brain states synchronize? And if they synchronize, does that predict learning? And so as you can see, every student in the classroom actually wore an EEG on their head. And then they had 2 conditions. In one condition, they looked at low engagement, meaning they weren't sort of working together, they were all kind of doing their own thing. And as you can see, their brain activities were not synchronized. They were different frequencies. However, as soon as they engaged together as a group, their brains actually synchronized to the same frequency. And this was across a whole classroom. So this was 20 to 30 subjects, 20 to 30 students actually. And what this means is that if you can get students working together and synchronizing their brain, then they can all learn more effectively together instead of being distracted independently. This has now helped policymakers in the United States actually create new policies to help students in the classroom figure out how to learn as a group so they can benefit better from the classroom and work more effectively. It's been pretty exciting. So imaging with brain electrical activity has given us a basic understanding about how the brain functions in different states, for example, like meditation. And then that knowledge has then allowed us to create technologies that can be applied to situations like the classroom or for consumers who want to learn how to meditate on their own. Now, what about manipulating brain activity? So this is an exciting new development in neurotechnology that's come out over the last 10 to 20 years. And each of these devices are created to put energy into the brain. So there's various ways that you can get energy into the brain across the skull. You can actually use strong magnets. You can use electrical activity, like with a battery hooked up to the head, believe it or not. You can actually use light. You can put light into the brain to manipulate the brain. And you can also use ultrasound. So I'm going to talk about each one of these different modalities and just try to give you a sense of how researchers and consumers are using these different devices to modulate their brain activity or to manipulate their brain activity. So first, let's talk about magnetic stimulation. This has been the most powerful form of brain stimulation that has come out in the last 20 years. Now, essentially, this is a very strong magnet that induces a magnetic and an electric field into the brain. This is basically what that looks like in the brain. So these would be the 2 magnetic coils on the outside of the head. And as you can see, by putting the coils over the brain, it induces magnetic and electric fields right over the cortex. And now the red part is the strongest part of the field. And so what that allows you to do is essentially focus the field right onto the brain. Now, this has been applied to all kinds of scientific questions, and very recently it has been approved by the Food and Drug Administration as a treatment for depression. So what you see in the picture here is the doctor is actually targeting one very small part of the brain with a magnetic coil, and over about an hour session, the doctor is treating a depressed patient just with the magnetic coil. It typically takes about 2 weeks, 4 to 5 times a week for the treatment to occur. And after about the first week, patients start feeling better. Their depression symptoms actually start going into remission. And after the second week, they get the same effect as if they were taking a drug intervention like Prozac or an SSRI. Now, whenever you take drug interventions like Prozac or antidepressants, you can expect all kinds of different side effects, as we all know. Everything from drowsiness to dry mouth, fatigue, nausea, and stomach problems. With magnetic stimulation, transcranial magnetic stimulation, there's actually really no side effects other than you can feel some discomfort on your scalp. And so you can see the huge benefit. These two interventions work just about the same in terms of reducing depression. But with magnetic stimulation, you see almost no side effects. And so it's a huge benefit for the patient. Now, in my lab recently, we've actually been using a magnetic stimulator to try to help people meditate and induce meditative states. And so this is a first-time meditator who's come into the lab. We teach them some basic meditation practices, usually Vipassana practices. And then they get a stimulation to a certain part of their brain that's involved in focusing the attention. And the end effect of this is that they're able to learn the meditation practice quicker. So instead of taking 8 weeks to go through a meditation course, they actually were learning the meditation over 4 weeks or even 2 weeks in some cases. And so this is a pretty great intervention because for people who don't have the time to meditate for long amounts of time, this can help them learn how to use the meditation faster, so when they go home, they can actually apply the practice with more ease. So that's magnetic stimulation. Let's move on to electrical stimulation. So believe it or not, you can hook electrodes up to a battery with a certain regulatory circuit, and you can induce a small electric current into the brain. So this is called transcranial direct current stimulation. The electrodes, if you spread them out across the scalp, you can actually run the current across the scalp and into the brain. And what that looks like in the brain is something like this. So depending on where you put the electrodes, you can see that it induces a tiny bit of current in the brain. Now we're talking about 2 milliamps. So this is a very, very small amount of electric current, but it's just enough to get into the brain to change brain activity temporarily. And this is what a typical setup would look like. So there's a little system that regulates the current, and then that's hooked up to some electrodes that are placed on the scalp. Now this has become a very popular brain stimulation technology over the past 10 years or so. There's been about 1,200 research papers that have studied this, from enhancing video gaming to attention and memory, all the way to treating almost any mental disorder that you can imagine, from depression, anxiety, PTSD, any types of traumas. You can place the electrodes on different parts of the brain and you can treat that brain disorder. So, exactly, it enhances learning, memory, perception, and emotion regulation, among other things. Now, very recently, transcranial direct current stimulation has seen different products emerging. This one's out of South Korea, actually. And this is designed specifically for the treatment of depression. So the battery is held right here over the ear, and it sends an electric current into these 2 little electrodes, and it's stimulating the part of the brain that's dysfunctional in depression. The company has not started any trials yet, but there's been several research experiments that have shown that this works effectively for over 60 to 70% of depressed patients. So again, they would wear this device probably for about 2 weeks at a time. And typically it works best if you're wearing the device while you're getting depression treatment. So you would go to a psychologist, you would get a neuropsychological treatment, and you'd be wearing the device during that session. And as you can see, it can be applied to anxiety. It can treat chronic pain, for example. And addiction tends to respond really well to TDCS. Now, this is just a small sample of all the consumer devices that have come out recently with these different transcranial direct current stimulation modalities. The Halo Sport is pretty interesting. This one is designed specifically for athletes. So you can see these are dry electrodes, actually. You don't actually even have to wet them. And athletes are actually wearing these while they're training. The idea is that it's stimulating the motor cortex and making it more excitable. So while the athlete trains, they can train a little bit harder and get more from their training regimen. Some of these other devices are just general use TDCS systems. And then this one down at the bottom is pretty interesting. It actually is supposed to be worn while you sleep, and it allows you to induce lucid dreaming. Now, lucid dreaming means that you're awake and you're aware of a dream while you're dreaming, sort of being conscious of your dream. And so several researchers have found that if you stimulate the brain while you're in a dream state, you can become lucid a little bit quicker. So that's a pretty exciting device, going straight from research right into the dream world. Here's another device that's come out from the United Kingdom, and it's essentially a little battery hooked up to electrodes that go in a band around your head. And this one's been very popular with video gamers. As you know, there's competitive video gaming that happens all around the world. And video gamers will try to wear this as they're competing in these competitions to enhance their brain, almost like drinking a big cup of coffee so you can perform really well. Now, believe it or not, you can actually use light to modulate the brain. This is a new technology that I've been very interested in over the past 2 years or so. So the device is worn on the head, and there's little LEDs that emit light into the brain. It looks a little something like this. So here you can see the emitter. It emits the light through the skull, and the light actually reaches into the brain. Now this device actually puts a little nose LED up your nose to try to send the light through the nose and into the brain as well. It's a little bit goofy looking, but it's effective. And as you can see, the nervous system and the brain is picking up that light activity. Now, this works inside the cell. The near-infrared light actually penetrates inside the cell and affects the mitochondrial activity. So this is the sort of power station for the cell. Mitochondria is what creates the energy inside the cell that the cell uses. And it turns out that red light, near-infrared light, can penetrate into the mitochondria, and through different mechanisms, it can actually increase the amount of energy that the cell is producing. This whole field is called photobiomodulation for anybody who's interested. And it's about 70 years old. We've known about this for a pretty long time. But it's only been very recently that we've been able to create devices that allow us to do this and take advantage of this phenomenon. And so you put light inside the cell, and you can actually increase ATP, or energy in the cell. Here's a new device that's come out. I think this one's in Britain as well. And as you can see, it's a pretty sophisticated looking thing here with some strange key that turns it on. And it's basically a helmet of LEDs that are meant to be worn by patients. So this one's a pretty strong device. And what's been found recently is that if you put a light helmet on patients with dementia and Alzheimer's, you can actually reduce the memory problems in these patients. This has actually worked to the point where it's been so powerful that the Food and Drug Administration in the United States self-funded a research study. because the effects were so big. And basically what they're finding is that just by wearing a little light helmet, if you have Alzheimer's disease, over a 4-week period, you can actually start improving those patients' outcomes. So these patients, of course, have memory deficit and memory problems. And what happens is that by putting light into the brain and creating the energy in the brain that allows the brain to heal, you can actually reduce some of those symptoms to a significant level. So light has been shown to enhance memory, learning, and attention. Actually, in my lab, we've been running a study with a very simple learning paradigm. So people are learning how to play the piano, for example. And by wearing a light helmet that looks a little bit something like this, while they're learning how to play the piano, they actually learn faster. And we think what's happening is actually by putting light into the brain and increasing the energy in the brain, they're actually able to sort of use their brain more effectively and actually practice longer. They have less burnout. And that less burnout allows them to continue with the piano playing until they learn the practice. Now, because of that, we actually started wondering if we could enhance meditation practice with light. And so very recently, we've started putting these light stimulators on meditators as they're trying to induce meditation states. And to our surprise, even within the first session, meditators are able to deepen into their meditative practice, and they're actually able to stay in meditation practice for much longer. So imagine if you can meditate for 30 minutes before you get distracted or frustrated. By wearing one of these devices, you may be able to meditate for an hour or 2 hours before you decide to get up. And so the end effect of that is that you're going to benefit more from that meditation practice because you're sort of sticking with it longer. This is actually my meditation teacher, Shinzen Young, who is one of the first brave souls to try this meditation plus light stimulation device. So the light stimulators are new and very interesting. What's really neat about these is you can design these very cheaply. The LEDs can be bought on Amazon for 25 cents a piece. And if you know about Arduino boards, a little controlled circuit, you can actually put together a full helmet for less than $10. So that's a pretty exciting technology if you think about designing devices that can treat things like depression, anxiety, and Alzheimer's disease. And then if you can actually enhance meditation as well, there's just several applications that can be had for very, very cheap. Now, very recently, my lab has gotten interested in ultrasound as another form of neurotechnology to stimulate the brain. Now that might surprise you because you probably know about ultrasound as an imaging modality that allows you to image a baby in the womb. Well, it turns out that you can use the same ultrasound system to modulate or change the brain activity as well. So this is one of my collaborators, Stuart Hammeroff, and you can see this is just a regular old hospital ultrasound held up to his head. And you can see on the screen, actually, that's his skull. And then you can see into his brain. So the ultrasound can get into the brain. And the question that Stuart asked is, could you actually change brain activity with an ultrasound? So he decided to put the ultrasound up to a part of the skull called the temporal window. It's a very thin part of the skull. And he got patients who have chronic pain. So these are people who have really bad back pain, for example. They've broken their back. And even if they're on drug treatments, they're still having a lot of really bad pain. And he basically stimulated a part of the brain with ultrasound that's involved in chronic pain and pain perception. What he found is that he could slightly decrease the pain. It wasn't significant, but it was pretty close. But in the pain patients, he actually found that he could significantly increase mood. So if you can imagine having chronic pain every day of your life, you would probably be in a pretty bad state. It makes you pretty upset. You're not a happy person when you're in pain. Imagine stumping your toe on the floor. So the fact that he could increase mood in these chronic pain patients was very significant to our group because it shows that perhaps decreasing the pain was actually causing them to feel a little bit better. Now in my lab, we've actually been using a new form of ultrasound called focused ultrasound. So this is an ultrasound transducer, and by curving the transducer, you can actually focus the ultrasound into the brain, and you can focus it to very deep structures in the brain. Now that's very exciting because all I've shown you so far, they can't get very deep into the brain. Like electrical stimulation just goes on the outside of the cortex. And magnetic stimulation can get just a little bit deeper, but just about to there. So focused ultrasound allows us now to get energy into any part of the brain so we can change the brain activity. So I started working with a company called Neurotrek, which was actually trying to make a device direct to consumers. But we did some research studies before they released it. And it's basically a very simple little ultrasound controller with a little ultrasound transducer that emits ultrasound into the brain. Here you can see, this is my little brother modeling the device. So you can see how small this is. And essentially what we did is we built this into a cap. So the subjects would come into the lab, they would wear this ultrasound transducer on their head, and this would actually focus the ultrasound into their brain to try to change their mood. And over several studies, over about 300 different subjects, essentially what we found is that you can make people feel better by targeting mood centers in their brain. And this was a pretty neat finding because it's relatively hard to make people feel better or to increase their well-being just within one session in the lab. But by focusing the ultrasound energy into the part of the brain that deals with happiness and feeling sort of positive mood, we could actually manipulate people's mood over about a 30-minute period. And then after that, what we decided to do was develop that into a protocol for treating depression. So the question then was, if this can enhance mood in healthy people, could we also enhance mood in depressed patients? And in fact, we did that over a 4-day trial. We could actually significantly increase mood in depressed patients and actually significantly decrease anxiety scores. So now we think we've designed a treatment that can treat both depression and anxiety with a very simple little ultrasound device. Now this whole device could be made for a couple $1,000s, and if we mass produce them, we could probably get it down to a couple $100s. So it gives you a sense of how you could scale this device if you wanted to, imagine if you wanted to treat depression and anxiety on a massive scale, thousands to millions of people, you could create a device for under $100. Now, very recently, researchers have been applying ultrasound again to the treatment of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. In a very interesting study that came out of Australia, researchers showed that by ultrasounding a rat's brain that has been given Alzheimer's-like disease, in 75% of those rats, you could actually reduce the amyloid beta plaques. So that's the sort of debris that builds up in the brain when you get dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And by just simply ultrasounding the rat's brain, you can actually reduce all those amyloid beta plaques. Now, interestingly, it restored the memory in 3 different tasks the rats were performing. It's very difficult to restore memory in Alzheimer's disease, but much like the light stimulation, the ultrasound as well was able to actually give memory back to these rats. And so that suggests that ultrasound could also be used as a treatment for Alzheimer's disease. And my group at the University of New Mexico is actually going to start running studies on Alzheimer's patients where we're using just a basic hospital ultrasound device, bringing the Alzheimer's patients into the lab for 2 weeks, and we're going to ultrasound them every day for 2 weeks to see if we can reduce their symptoms. Now, if that works, which we have a good reason to think it will, that means that any imaging ultrasound device in any hospital in the world can actually be used to treat Alzheimer's and dementia. So that gives you a sense of how you could actually scale this very quickly across the world. So we're starting that study actually in a couple weeks, and we're very excited about it. But it gives you a sense of how you can actually take advantage of technology that we already have and use it in a new and interesting way. So what we've seen is that you can actually use neurotechnology to image the brain, to read brain activity, which allows you to understand brain function. Now, understanding brain function then allows you to create technologies and consumer devices that can be used to allow the consumer to enhance their well-being, as well as increase their brain function, much like caffeine or coffee allows you to increase your brain function. We've also seen that you can manipulate the brain with different technologies. These technologies allow you to alter brain function in a temporary fashion. All the technologies I've shown you up until now, they're all safe. They don't do any damage to the brain, but they allow you to temporarily alter brain function. And because of that, it actually allows you to create clinical interventions. For example, you can use these technologies to treat depression, anxiety, and Alzheimer's disease. And then what I'm really interested in recently is actually using these manipulative brain technologies to enhance brain function. So for example, helping people to enhance their attention and their memory, or helping people learn faster, like for example, learning the piano faster. And the one I've really been interested in very recently is actually trying to enhance the brain function. So just quickly, I'll show you another couple of slides. So with focused ultrasound, for example, this shows how you can get the ultrasound into the human brain and how focal it can be. So this is a focal spot of ultrasound into the brain, looking at it from different slices. And what we've found actually is that we can focus the ultrasound down into a part of the brain that's involved in meditation. So this is called the anterior cingulate cortex. This is the part of the brain that sort of controls your attention and your focus. And when you're learning how to meditate, the anterior cingulate actually significantly activates. And so the idea was if we could stimulate that part of the brain with neurotechnology and make it more activated while you're meditating, you should be able to go into a meditation state faster, which is exactly what we found. So here in the baseline condition is sort of baseline meditation state. And after the stimulation of the anterior cingulate cortex, we actually increased people's meditative state. Now, interestingly, if you compare that to a placebo condition, there was actually no effect, and actually the meditation state goes down a little bit, which you might expect in a study with a placebo condition. So working with a very famous meditation teacher named Shinzen Young. Shinzen is a Zen meditation monk from the United States, as you can see here, but he studied in Japan. Shinzen and I have been investigating a very interesting disorder called athymormia. Now, athymormia essentially happens when someone gets a damage to a very particular circuit in their brain. And the patients become very locked in to the current moment. So a way to think about this is the patients just sort of come into the operating room or the doctor's office, for example, and the patients just sit there. In terms of meditation, very advanced meditation practitioners are able to feel something like pain without having significant suffering generated around the pain signal. And so Shinzen and I decided to use athymormia as a model to try to stimulate the brain to enhance deep meditation states, so people can experience those states while they're trying to meditate. I want to give you a sense of what this looks like. So this is an MRI of Shinzen's brain, and this is the part of the brain that we're targeting with ultrasound. And you can see it's very deep in the brain. Any area you look at here, it's a very deep target. But with focused ultrasound, we can actually reach that part of the brain. Now, to get to that part of the brain, we have to use the brain image to target right down into the brain. So you can see here, this is this patient's brain on the computer, and she's actually getting a depression treatment. So that's that strong magnetic coil. What this computer does is it tracks her head in space. So she's actually wearing a device on her head that the cameras can see, and it basically tells the doctor exactly where to put the device on her head so we can reach that part of the brain, in this case to treat depression. So for us, we actually started trying to use this system to target the part of the brain that should enhance meditation while Shenzhen and other participants were meditating. Now, you can see the thing on his head, that's what's tracking his head in space, and this is his brain actually loaded into the computer. Now, this is going to tell us exactly where, it's going to tell me, example, that's me, by the way, that's what I look like. This is going to tell me exactly where to put this on his head so we can reach the target in the brain. And then we turn the ultrasound on just for very brief moments of time over an hour period while he's meditating. And the end effect of this is that it helps his brain to become more balanced. So while he's meditating, if there's a challenging emotional state, for example, this intervention allows him to sort of let go of that emotional state so he can come back to his meditation practice, and he can practice with more ease and more fluidity. So, I've shown you various neurostimulation and neuromodulation technologies, as well as imaging technologies that allow us both to read brain activity as well as alter brain function. And collectively, these can be used together to understand what brain health and brain activation looks like, and then how to help people change their brain activity in an effective and healthy way so they can increase their well-being and also increase their overall brain function. Thank you very much for listening.